2 signatures, 1 confession. And according to the department's own paperwork, 2 different detectives were both in the interrogation room at 11:42 on the same night, taking the same statement from the same man. Only one of them could have been telling the truth.
The problem was, nobody could prove which one. And one of the 2 detectives on that paperwork might never have existed at all.
This is the case of Danny Ruiz, convicted 6 years ago for the murder of shop owner Owen Castellano. And it starts, like most of these do, with a routine file review nobody expected to matter. Castellano was found in the back room of his hardware store on a Tuesday morning, a single wound, the register untouched. Ruiz had worked 2 shifts there the month before, and a partial print on a box cutter in the back room put detectives on him within a week. He denied it for 3 days. Then came the confession that ended the case. Signed, sealed, and never seriously challenged again until now. Investigator Grace Okonkwo works internal audits for the department. The quiet kind, the paperwork kind. She wasn't looking for a conspiracy. She was checking a bail reform compliance box, confirming old confessions were properly logged before a state review. Ruiz's file should have taken 10 minutes. It didn't close in 10 minutes. It didn't close for 6 months. The file only landed on Okonkwo's desk because Ruiz's appellate investigator, working the case for free on a hunch, had already noticed the same thing and filed a formal complaint the department couldn't quietly bury. He hadn't found a conspiracy either. He just found 2 names where the form only had room for 1, and asked a question nobody had bothered to ask in 6 years. The confession that convicted Ruiz was short, 4 sentences, unsigned by a lawyer because Ruiz had waived one. It was witnessed and countersigned by Detective Thomas Kellerman, badge 3117, at 11:42 p.m. But the booking log for that same night, the log that tracks who physically checked into which interrogation room, showed Detective Rachel Voss, badge 2288, also entering at 11:42, also assigned to Ruiz. Same night. Same suspect. Same minute. 2 names. Okonkwo assumed it was a clerical mistake at first. Clerical mistakes happen constantly in old paper systems. A digit transposed, a shift log filed under the wrong date. So she pulled both detectives' personnel files expecting to find an easy answer. What she found instead was 2 complete, functioning careers. 15 years of arrests for Kellerman. 12 years for Voss. Commendations, disciplinary notes, partner assignments, the works. 2 real detectives, 2 real signatures. So why did the timeline only leave room for one of them? The confession wasn't the only evidence against Ruiz. A knife with a partial print. A neighbor's shaky sighting. But everyone involved in the original trial agreed it was the piece that closed the case. Without it, the rest was thin enough that a good defense attorney could have picked it apart in an afternoon. That's what made the 2 names on the paperwork more than a filing error. It meant the strongest piece of evidence in the case had 2 different, mutually exclusive origin stories. Okonkwo went to Voss first, since Voss was still active on the force. Voss's answer was immediate and calm. She'd been in that room. She remembered Ruiz's face, remembered the coffee stain on the table, remembered exactly what he said. Kellerman's name on the paperwork, she said, must be an error. Maybe he'd been logged for a different suspect that same shift and it got crossed. Voss's longtime partner, Deputy Ray Ostrander, backed her without hesitating. He'd driven her to the station that night. He remembered walking her in. That should have closed it, except when Okonkwo tried to find Kellerman to ask him directly. She couldn't. Not because he'd retired. Not because he was hard to reach. Because Detective Thomas Kellerman, badge 3117, hadn't clocked in anywhere in the department in over 2 years, and the desk sergeant on duty that week couldn't picture his face. Can you already feel where this is going? Okonkwo pulled everything she could on Kellerman. academy graduation class of a decade and a half ago. His name was on the roster, but the class photo had a gap where his headshot should sit, marked photo unavailable. The same as 3 other names on record for unrelated reasons. His listed home address, when she drove to it, was a leased storage unit facility, not a house. His listed partner across 5 separate arrest reports wasn't the same person twice. Kellerman had apparently worked with 4 different partners over 3 years, and none of those partners remembered working a single shift with him. A detective with 15 years on paper, and nobody who could say they'd stood next to him. A handwriting examiner Okonkwo brought in for the countersignature made it worse before it made it clearer. Kellerman's signature on Ruiz's confession didn't match Kellerman's signature on 2 of his older arrest reports. The pen pressure was different. The loop on the K leaned the opposite direction. Whoever had signed for Kellerman that night wasn't the same person who'd signed for him 5 years earlier. Which meant, whatever Kellerman was, he wasn't one person wearing one name consistently. He was a name more than one person had used. Here's where most cases like this fall apart into a simple answer: a stolen badge number, an ex-cop running a scam, something a background check should have caught years ago. That's what Okonkwo expected too. So she cross-referenced Kellerman's badge number 3117 against every case file it had ever appeared on, going back as far as records existed. It appeared on 11 confessions over 14 years. Every one of them from a different assigned detective's caseload. Every one of them logged at odd, late hours. And every one of them, when Okonkwo checked the underlying interrogations, involved a suspect who'd waived a lawyer, been questioned for far longer than department policy allowed, or made statements that wouldn't have held up if attributed to the detective who actually ran the interview. Kellerman wasn't a person. Kellerman was a name the department could put on the paperwork whenever a confession was obtained a little too aggressively to survive attaching a real detective's badge to it. Pause here and sit with that for a second. 11 confessions. 14 years. One name that never clocked in anywhere, but somehow always showed up exactly when a case needed a signature that couldn't be traced back to anyone who'd have to answer for how it was gotten. Okonkwo drove out to the state prison to hear Ruiz's side directly, something nobody had bothered doing since his appeal was first denied. Ruiz didn't remember a Kellerman. He remembered a woman across the table, calm, patient, still talking to him at 4 in the morning after he'd asked twice to stop. He described her hair, her height, a scar near her eyebrow. It matched Voss exactly. In 6 years, he'd never once been asked to describe the detective on his own confession, because the paperwork already told everyone who it was, and the paperwork was wrong. Okonkwo went back to Voss with the 11 case list. She laid it on the table and asked one question. Who taught you how to become Kellerman? Voss didn't deny it this time. She said it had been passed to her 9 years earlier by her own training officer, a captain named Earl Dunmore, 3 months before he retired. Quietly, the way department folklore gets passed instead of written down. When an interrogation ran past, what would hold up under her own name? When a suspect talked because he'd been worn down past the point defense attorneys would call coercion. She logged it as Kellerman's. The badge number had been recycled from an actual detective who died in the line of duty decades earlier. His identity never formally retired from the system, just quietly reused whenever the department needed a confession that couldn't survive a real name attached to it. Ruiz's confession, Voss admitted, was hers. She'd questioned him for 6 hours without a break, past the point he'd asked twice to stop, and logged it under Kellerman because she knew, even then, that it wouldn't survive appeal under her own badge. So which detective was real? Voss was real. The confession was hers. But the record, the only version of events a courtroom ever saw, belonged to a man who never existed at all.
There was one detail Voss couldn't explain, and it unsettled Okonkwo more than anything else in the file.
2 of the 11 Kellerman confessions were logged on nights Voss could prove, with time-stamped receipts and a hospital visit, that she wasn't even on shift. Someone else had worn the name too, at least twice, years before Voss ever learned the trick existed. Kellerman wasn't Voss's secret. Kellerman was the department's. Assistant DA Marisol Fenn moved to have Ruiz's conviction vacated within a week of Okonkwo's report reaching her desk. Not because Ruiz was necessarily innocent. That question stayed open. But because a confession attributed to a fabricated detective couldn't be entered as evidence by any legal definition. Ruiz got a new trial. Voss got suspended pending a full misconduct review. Captain Dunmore, 3 years into retirement, declined to comment through his attorney.
You'd think that's where it ends.
A ghost detective exposed, a wrongful confession undone, an investigator who did her job well. Except 2 weeks after the case closed, Okonkwo's supervisor called her into his office and told her something that never made it into any report. He said the department had used the Kellerman identity sparingly since Voss's exposure. Maybe once, maybe twice. Because eliminating it entirely would mean reopening every one of those 11 old cases. And the department wasn't ready for that kind of reckoning. He said it the way you'd mention an old habit nobody's quite ready to quit. And then he said they needed someone new to carry it going forward. Someone careful, someone who already understood exactly how it worked, and exactly why it existed. He didn't ask her outright. He didn't have to. 2 signatures sat on one confession, and only one of the names behind them had ever been real.
By the time Grace Okonkwo left that office, she understood the paperwork completely, and she also understood that somewhere down the line, another investigator was going to pull an old file, find 2 names on one confession, and start asking exactly the questions she just had.